Some of the events of that terrible weekend in 1954 are captured here on film and in photos, plus personal interviews with those who were touched and those who survived. A half-century later, we looked at what they thought important enough to visually record, keep, and bring out to share with their grandchildren's generation. Now, this recording is not so much an historical account of the event as an attempt to give an understanding of its impact on the lives of those who lived through it and on metropolitan Toronto and its surrounding area. The recollections follow the course of the largest of Toronto's rivers, the Humber, and its transformation from its usual gentle self to the unrecognizable, unpredictable, raging torrent which swept people to their deaths as onlookers watched helpless.
After 50 years, memories of Hurricane Hazel are still vivid in many people's minds. We've set out to record some of these vivid memories, some from people's memories and comments, some from their film and photographic records. A half-century after the event, we are looking at what they thought important enough to visually record, keep, and bring out to share with their grandchildren's generation. This recording is being made not so much as an historical account of the event, but rather an attempt to give an understanding of it, its impact on the lives of those who lived through it, and on metropolitan Toronto and its surrounding area. Recollections will follow the course of the largest of Toronto's river, the Humber, and its transformation from the usual gentle self to the unrecognizable, unpredictable, raging torrent which swept people to their deaths as on.
I'm Max Deegan, and I've been interviewed because of Hurricane Hazel, apparently. Now, I don't know if I'm pertinent to this story because I left in 1954. I left Switzerland. Well, on the boat we hit a hell of a storm, and for 2 or 3 nights they had to batten down the tables, and they couldn't serve the dishes because it was flying from one end to the other. And it was so bad that they had a staircase that went out sideways both ways. We could wait to get up the stairs. You could wait till the boat tilted so much, walked across, and up she went. You know,
because of the hurricane?
That was because of the hurricane. But at that time, I didn't know yet it was Hurricane Hazel. It was just a big storm, and it delayed the trip. By the time we got into the St. Lawrence north of Newfoundland, it quieted down, and all of a sudden we seen people we've never seen before, because all these guys were sick in the bunks, and they showed up again. Now in Quebec City, I got off the boat and climbed up from the harbor up to the hill, and just to look at the city, and then decided, hey, this is worse than Europe. That looked older than Europe. So back on the boat off to Montreal. In Montreal, the big news broke that Hurricane Hazel hit, because I arrived on October 22nd. I was in Quebec City. On the 23rd, I arrived in Montreal. So my first remembrance of
Well, my name is Robert Anderson. I'm known as Bob, though, and at the time of Hurricane Hazel, I was 29 years old. We had just been married that spring, May the 1st of 1954, and I was a salesman at that time, and I lived down on Barrie Road, just about perhaps less than a quarter of a mile, maybe equivalent of 2 city blocks from the Humber River, and that's why the noise, the roar of this river made me very much aware of what was going on at the time, the rain and the water that was pouring. Well, I recall it very distinctly because we had gone to play bridge with some friends of ours, and during the evening it was just pouring rain and rain and rain, and we could hear it, and the lights went out, and we were quite upset because the lights had been out for quite some time, and I remember our host Don Davis phoned the hydro and said, "What's going on?" They said, "Well, we're having a hard time with the wind and rain and this storm," and so we decided we couldn't play bridge anymore, and my wife and I went home, and I can't remember just what bridge it was that we we drove over, but I think it was probably at Prince Edward Drive. No, it wasn't. Oh dear, I'm not so sure. But anyway, I remember reading in the paper the following day that bridge went out just about 1 hour after we passed over it. Well, I recall waking up on the Saturday morning and I could hear this roar, and we didn't know quite what it was, and I can't remember if somebody told us you should see the Humber River or what, but anyway, I recall walking down to the river, and it was just immense at that point. That's right at the foot of Barry Road. No, I saw nothing at that point other than a lot of debris floating down the river. I seem to recall around the old mill at a later date seeing a bus or a fire, maybe it was a fire truck that was in the river around there, but I don't think it had any impact other than inconvenience, getting around bridges, traffic for some time, perhaps a month or more. But other than that, it had no...
Where we are now standing was underwater, very underwater. The flood crest here was 20 feet above ground. On the north side, that's this side of the pylons. The water crest on the south side of them was lower by 3 to 5 feet. That was a meter to a meter and a half. That blue line up there with the little waves on the top and the little fishies swimming in it, that was the height of the flood crest. You can see it from the subway when you ride by. So that anyone in Toronto who rides the TTC or walks through here can see.
My name is Jim McFadden, and I was 21 on the 11th of that October, and I lived 31 houses west of the Humber River on Queen Mary's Drive. On the following morning, I was awakened by a friend of mine, the now Dr. Elliot Barker, who was on the east side of the Bloor Bridge with his mother. And the Bloor Bridge could not be crossed, he said, would I go down and pick him up at the west side of the bridge and drive he and his mother home into the Kingsway area, which I did. And it was on that drive, short drive from the Bloor Bridge to his place, that he told me of this hurricane that had happened and the bridge that had given out on the Humber River and all of the problems, and said we have to go up and volunteer. They were calling for volunteers out on Dundas Street at Bud Islington Avenue. I've forgotten the building because it was on the south side. And while in that lineup, and my friend had his med school jacket on. And actually he had thrown me a jacket before I went, which was a brother of his jacket, which was also a med school jacket with a graduating year before his. Two people came up. One was the chief of police, Andy Hamilton at the time, and the other was the coroner. And they looked at him and said, "Have you done your work on cadavers?" And he said yes, and I guess they just assumed I had because of the year on my jacket, and said, "Would you boys be kind enough to set up a morgue for us? We have a problem that there are a lot of people apparently dead, and they're being taken anywhere and everywhere, and families don't know where to go to identify their families." So they wanted to set up a central morgue, which we did, on the second floor of the fire hall on Dundas Street, just the other side of Burnhamthorpe, just west of Burnhamthorpe. They divided the second floor, which was one big room really. They divided the second floor of that fire station into roughly two. And the southern half, overlooking Dundas, we were given, Elliot Barker and myself, and behind that they put a row of temporary partitions and some temporary tables and chairs, and the Salvation Army worked behind that line. And you know, there was no elevator in that building, and everybody that was brought in and carried upstairs and put in our section, and we washed them down, went through any, if they had clothes on, and went through any clothes that they had, looked for identification. We put a tag on them with a number, and we wrote a description as best we could. It was all guess in terms of height and weight type and age. They were all guesses. And we laid them out on the floor in 3 rows, men, women, and children, and roughly in age as best we could guess it. So that when somebody came upstairs looking for a family member, they would go to the Salvation Army and they would come in and tell us that they're looking for a 38-year-old female, let's say. And we only had 1 or 2 blankets to fold back that way. So we did that, not for very long. I would say it was 3 or 4 days.
Hi, I'm Mark Cowan. Slayman, and 50 years ago I was Mark Cowan. My mom and dad had a house on Humberview Road, 55 Humberview Road, and we overlooked the whole Humber Valley. And then the next morning getting up and walking down, once our parents had given us permission, walking down to the old mill and seeing what wasn't there anymore, the big hole where the bridge used to be, the approach to the bridge, and it was gone, and the water rushing, and the police not letting us go near it because for safety. And my mom, she's back at home making sandwiches at home and giving them, I'm not quite sure how they got to where they went to, but they got there. Very quiet, very quiet. I remember it was quiet and people were just looking and shaking their heads and walking away. No, I don't think there was gawkers. People maybe wanting to help or people to understand that it was amazing, that hole, this huge gaping hole where the approach used to be. Water running and running. The debris came later when the water receded. But at that time, Mom and Dad wouldn't let us go down the valley because that wasn't a place for us to be. Not that it only was not safe, but it wasn't a good idea to be there when people were working. I remember the helicopter coming up and down off the Bloor Viaduct, because that was, first of all, to see a helicopter, and second of all, to see it going up and down off a bridge so close to the area that I used to run and play cowboys and Indians in, that whole Humber Valley. That's what we used to do as kids, play in that, the valley area. We weren't allowed on the Bloor Street Viaduct, of course, because although the helicopter could land, they weren't sure whether or not the viaduct would hold up to any kind of usage. That's my memory. I mean, obviously the cars were getting across on one bridge. I don't know if it was the Dundas.
There were many acts of quiet heroism, mostly of people doing just what needed to be done, uncomprehending of the danger approaching them. The most tragic of these was the Lambton Islington fire truck and its volunteer crew that came down this road beside the river in response to a rescue call for 2 teenagers in a car. 5 of the men were swept to their deaths, and the fire truck was recovered downriver. Later, the door was ground up and melted into a bronze plaque, which stands attached.
My name is Ken Maxwell. I was with the Etobicoke Fire Department in 1954. I was 25 years of age, and I was living on Winiska Avenue, just off Park Lawn Road. And Kingsway Lambton, we were in the fire hall. We had been told by the acting district chief Roy Weech, or acting chief Royal Weech, not to respond to any water-related calls like basement flooding and stuff like that, or cats out of a tree, strictly emergencies. But we had the only communication we had with the Kingsway Lambton truck prior to them going down the river was through the radio on our truck. So we turned the radio on in our truck, and we could hear them on their radio as the water was rising up, and they were screaming for help. And to get a tow truck, which we tried to get from old Sid's garage. He had the biggest tow truck in Etobicoke in those days down on Roy York Road. But it, unbeknownst to us, it was busy at Marie Curtis Park, at the Pleasant Valley Trailer Park in those days, trying to pull the trailers out. And he didn't have a radio, to the best of our knowledge anyway. But finally, the volunteer from the Kingsway Lambton, their yells and screams for help became so desperate that Captain Smith, he says, forget orders right now, we're going to their rescue and see what we can do. So we took off, and there was 4 of us on the fire truck. And most of us on Etobicoke Fire Department at that time, 1/3 of us, all of us, were from the Humber Bay area, living right adjacent to the river. And Jack Smith and myself were both on the same truck that went up there to try to rescue the Kingsway volunteer firefighters. Yes, the most vivid one is trying to save the men on the Kingsway Lambton truck, and being at the embankment down behind the Boylan Estate off the Kingsway there, and the rushing water coming down and the guys yelling for help, and me climbing out on the fence with a coil of rope thinking that I could throw it to these fellas, but I just couldn't, because they were at least 100 feet away from me when the furthest I got, until I became trapped by the water, and it was rising up. I had started out on the fence with the water around my knees somewhere, and within 15 minutes the big surge had come down, and now I was hanging onto the fence for dear life. And with that, I remember seeing the truck, the fellows gave a yell and the truck moved, and I remember seeing the headlights moving up in the air. The headlights of the truck were still on, plus the spotlights. And I remember seeing that going up in the air and then going down river, maybe 15, 20 feet, and realizing then that we're in serious trouble. With that, I was going back down on the fence to get back to shore, and Captain Smith was right there, Jack Smith, and he helped me off the fence and grabbed me just in time before I went down the river. But with that, the last thing I can remember is the truck lifting up in the air and rolling over. The reason we could tell it was rolling over was because we could see the lights of the truck, especially the spotlights on the cab of the truck. They went up in the air, swung around in a big arc, and then disappeared under the water. And there was just utter silence from the men. Never heard a word from the men then. And they were gone. We were stunned in silence. We just stared there, and then we started running down the bank of the river trying to see if we could rescue any of the men that had been swept off the truck. And the police were there too, and with that we went down, and we got a hold of one fellow from Kingsway Lambton. He was caught in the bushes, and with the help of a policeman I grabbed him, and I think his name was Bell. I'm not 100% sure on that, what his name was now. But we grabbed him, but he was unconscious. So we tried doing what is called CPR on him now. It wasn't CPR in those days. But then the couple other policemen come down, and they took him up the bank. I never did see him again. And another lad that was on the fire department, the permanent fire department at that time, he was also working with the volunteers that night. And he got down the river, but he says that he had a jacket on with tight wrist. And when he went off the truck, slid off the truck, the air trapped in his jacket, and that's actually what helped him float down the river, and he went further down. I never did see him, but he crawled out himself. He was lucky, Jimmy Britton. Yeah.
The one that really upset me is there were 5 firemen killed, and I'm not sure whether it was 1 or 2, but at least one, Tiny, was the fire station was right behind the public school, and he was a caretaker at the public school, so we all knew who he was, and it was upsetting when they brought him in.
It was down in, I think it was Etobicoke or down in York Township, is where they lost a fire truck with about 6 or 7 volunteer firemen on it. Well, it shows the strength.
I guess the more significant memory of it was once we had found out that some firemen had lost their lives. My father was furious about that people during a storm would go down nearby the river to look as tourists kind of thing when there was flooding going on, and that the fact that those men lost their lives trying to save them. Oh. So the family was really aware of this tragedy, and we'd gone to church on Sunday, as we would at Victoria Church. And we'd come back home and had our lunch. And after lunch, I got up. And as I told you earlier, the dining room looked over down the valley. And so I was looking to see what the water was doing now. And I kept looking and looking. And finally I said, Dad, what's that red thing in the river? And he got the binoculars out. He looked at it, quietly put the binoculars down, went to the telephone, and phoned the authorities or the Toronto Star. I'm never quite sure which order that was, because Dad worked for the Toronto Star, to say that we thought we had located the fire engine. I remember that very clearly. It's funny because it's kind of black and white in my memory, but this little...
It's Madeline McDowell. I was 13 years old in 1954, and I remember leaving our house on Humbercrest, walking down the street and down St. Mark's Hill on Saturday morning. We stopped halfway down the hill because the bottom of St. Mark's Road was washed out, and you could see the flooding on the basements that were dug out for the new houses. The market garden at the bottom of the hill was more or less dry. It had been flooded a little bit, but the greenhouses hadn't been damaged.
From an interview with Joseph Galambozzi. My name is Joseph Galambozzi. At the time of Hurricane Hazel, I was 32 and we lived on Blackthorn. I was a service technician for Borden. I used to cross the old iron bridge on Old Dundas to avoid the traffic on the high-level bridge. At 10 a.m. on Saturday, October 16th, I was returning from a service call on Bloor Street West and, as usual, crossed the old iron bridge. The roadway was damaged, in particular the west approach. As I crossed the bridge, the authorities erected barricades behind me. The bridge was declared unsafe as the...
This is from Dorothy Rhodes Valentino. The Friday of the flood, my mother had just hung the drapes she made for the big windows of a new living room that my stepfather built over a large cement patio attached to the stand and the house. The sturdiness of that construction probably held the rest of the building in place because it took the force of the water. I remember the fierce wind that night, but our fear was of the huge trees that surrounded us, not the river. Although it did get much wilder during the spring flood time, it had never expanded over the banks in our area in recent times. We were awakened by a friend of my brother's from the Warren Park area who saw the water rising on his way home, and thinking that Mom and I were alone down there, came to warn us. He had to leave his car and climb the hill with us too. The water level rose so rapidly at that point that by the time we crossed the lawn, it was hard to walk, and the ditch that used to be the mill race was a fast-running torrent. I don't remember much other than panic of those minutes. Somehow my mother, stepfather, stepbrother, Kenny, 2 Cocker Spaniels and myself got across and climbed the steep, slippery hill. We went to the fire hall at the top of the hill and were taken to a friend's house in Warren Park. I was too full of adrenaline to stay put, so my girlfriend and I spent the rest of the night near the old bridge on Dundas, watching the water and all the things that came down the river and smashed into the bridge. We had to move away as the ground at our end started crumbling. By morning, the road was washed out at the end of the bridge, as was much of the river road. Next morning, the army was stopping people from going along the road, so my stepfather and brothers went down the hill to see what they could rescue. Unfortunately, they were not first on the scene, and much of what was safely above water level had been pulled down and dumped in the mud by looters. We did manage to salvage some clothes and the new drapes, which were still in place even though the windows were broken. My mother did a lot of laundry during the next few days. Those curtains never totally lost the waterline mark, but we used them in our next home. Inside the house, the mud was very deep and hard to walk in. Most of the walls were smashed with big holes and slats showing. Next to the beds, the sheets were driven into the open spaces. The fridge was completely full of silt, as if it were mold. None of the furniture was salvageable. A big desk was washed out a door and disappeared with all our family pictures and Mum's good linens. That day we watched a helicopter rescue a body of a woman that was caught in the middle of the river. There are a lot of bitter memories of the aftermath of the flood and of things that happened to my parents when they dealt with the bureaucracy that was set up to deal with flood victims. I hope I've been able to tell you what you wanted.
After we left the Kingsway, we went back to the fire hall, and I think it was about maybe half an hour after that, we changed our clothes real quick. We were all soaking wet. Put the coffee on, didn't get a chance to even drink it, and they dispatched the, I was working on a Royal York Hall just above the Queensway at that time, and they told us to go over to Scarlett Road, nearby the old Queensbury Hotel. It's gone, long gone now, to see if we could help there. When we arrived there, it was shortly, there was nothing we could do. The water was just rushing over. The water was up over the bridge, or the roadway coming down, and there was an awful lot of volunteers there. There was another fire truck there. There was a police cars there, and I was standing looking north on Scarlett Road just at the entrance to the bridge, the approach to the bridge, when this, I believe they told me later that it was probably the last house from Raymore Drive come floating around the corner, and I couldn't believe it. Here was a house floating like a houseboat, like a boat coming down the river, and all the vehicle lights were on, of course, and this house come across there, and I can remember it was about a story and a half, and at the window on the top of the house on the V, there was a man in the window, and I suspect he was going to try and jump out the window at the last moment and land on the bridge, but anyway, the water was coming so fast he didn't have a chance, and the bridge, the house smashed right into the bridge, and with that, part of the roof landed on the on top of the bridge and slithered all over coming towards us where we were standing, but the rest of the house and the man disappeared under the bridge in the wreckage, and we never saw him at all. No.
Hi, my name was Kay Dunkling. I lived on Leyden Avenue near Scarlett Road in St. Clair, Scarlett Road and Dundas area. I worked in Mead's drugstore. My cousin Russell Smith had lived next door to us for many years on Leyden Avenue, moved down to the Scarlett Road. He lived in the recreation room which they had built for hay rides after the Queensbury Riding School was built. He decided not to have hay rides anymore, and he and his wife and child built a 3-room little apartment out of this recreation room. The night of Hurricane Hazel, he came home from working. He also ran a construction company, and he had to pay for all his men on his kitchen table. When he arrived home, he saw the recreation hall, there was no basement, moving down the Humber River. So Russell ran in, he grabbed the pay from the table, jumped off, got onto the shore, and just as he got there, the house went right against the Humber Bridge at Scarlett Road. So the men did get paid, but he, wasn't thinking of his life or that would happen. He just went in and he was concerned about getting them paid.
I remember them talking about that the water started to come into the basement, and then when the water came in the doors, I think they started giving the beer away. There was somebody talking about that, free rounds for everybody, and they were well flooded out.
When my father and his uncles, and actually his two brothers came along too, and my brother Bill was only in his early 20s at the time, they went not only to Scarlett Road, but they were over to the Chinese Gardens in the flats at Jane Street. Used to be, we called it the old Chinese, sorry, it was the Chinese Gardens, but you came through Jane Street, it was the old Jane Street dump. And then you got into the gardens and people grew lots of vegetables and fruits and people would go and buy from there. And they were all wiped out, and that's where a lot of the boats that my dad and his relatives took to rescue a lot of people there as well.
It happened, well, it wasn't too funny, in that my grandmother had gone to visit one of her friends in the Jane Street flats, or in the flats. No. And the water was coming, just like the song says, 4 foot high rising. And finally the firemen came in the boat to get these two old gals out of the house. But they were caught in bed, and they wouldn't get out until they had their, what they call stays on, their girdles on. And in the meantime, the water's rising, and it turned out that the two old gals couldn't get in the boat, the water was too high, and the firemen had to push them uphill. So that Saturday was, the 16th was my mother's birthday. And we spent my mother's birthday looking for my grandmother because we didn't know where she was or where the firemen had taken her or what had happened to the house.
The people of Weston were familiar with the Humber in flood. The town had moved from the valley to the high ground in the 1850s when people recognized the danger of being flooded out. Raymore Drive was a pleasant, little-known residential back street that curved down by the river on the Etobicoke side of the Oxbow at Weston. A swaying wood and metal suspension bridge linked the community on the west bank with the main town. It was well used for shopping and general access, as well as being a popular spot by the river for the teenagers. At the height of the deluge, the bridge withheld a tremendous weight of debris, forming a dam and a water buildup, until the cable connection at the western abutment snapped. When this happened, the entire current was directed to the curve of Raymore Drive. 35 people lost their lives there when their homes were washed away. There is now a new pedestrian and cycle bridge with a plaque commemorating the tragedy at Raymore, located near the western.
My name is Jack Carson. At the time of Hurricane Hazel, I was 27 years of age, and I been with the Weston Police Department for approximately 10 or 11 months. October the 15th, I reported for duty, which is a Friday night, for 4 o'clock. And at that time, I resumed the duty with one of the scout cars. Traffic was heavy. The rains were very, very hard and heavy at the time coming down. The curbs had water laying in them. Sewers wouldn't take it away fast enough. Approximately around 8 or 8:30 at night, they had a bad accident, a fatality on Western Road. At that time, it was called Main Street South. The investigation lasted for some time there. The Chief Constable Webster, he came over and took charge of it. And about 10 o'clock or 10:30 at night, things were more or less cleared up from there. Went back to normal patrol, and they started to watch the water levels around a lot of the side streets and around the Humber River. And approximately 11:30 at night, one of the sergeants at the time, Len Cowling, he lived at the north end of Weston. I believe it was on D Avenue, which is just south of the 401. His wife called the station as he was working as well to say that there's people hollering in that from the river. So at that point, they started to put the cars out to check the area. And the Chief Constable was called. He came in and held all the afternoon shift back for the storm. I went out about midnight again in the scout car, and my detail was to go to Lawrence Avenue and Little Avenue by the Lawrence Avenue Bridge. At this point, I parked the car on Little Avenue, got out, walked down to the bridge, out onto the bridge, and you could see the water gradually coming higher and higher in the riverbank. And what was happening, at that time, there's all shrubs, little small trees and that, were being washed out. And the trees and everything was collecting underneath the bridge. At that point, when it was just plugged, the water would go around the approaches of the bridge, which is more or less consisted of sand with asphalt and cement on top. Approximately 12:30, 20 to 1, you could see pieces of wood from houses and that coming down, but you couldn't see any people hanging on to anything, or you couldn't hear anything but the loud roar of the water. And then shortly after that, I'd say approximately around 1 o'clock, or 5 after 1, there was a transformer on the northeast corner of the Humber River, which the first street is Little Avenue there, was right at the corner. And the water was coming up, washing around the pole, and eventually, we did not know at the time, I had got off the bridge, but all the approaches on each side of the bridge was washed out.
Mary Louise Ashbourne, and I was 19 years old at the time of Hurricane Hazel, living in Weston. After we realized the problems that had occurred along the river, we all went down to look. A lot of rubberneckers were down there because just amazed to see what had happened to the Humber River. Close by was the arena, and my father was very involved with the Lions Club and very involved in the building of the arena and then in operating the arena. It had been, I guess, about 5 years in operation at that point, maybe only 4, but I think maybe 5. In any case, he was very concerned because, of course, the water rose 5 feet up the walls of the arena. When it receded, they realized all their records were sodden in the books, the record books that had been kept in the arena. And my father, being a very practical man, felt that they couldn't be left as such, so he carted them home in their very wet and probably not too savory state, spread newspapers on our living room floor, and then proceeded to spread all the records of the arena out on top of these newspapers, and my mother, bless her heart, put up with it. However, that's how all the records for the arena were saved. And we could get no further, of course, than Little Avenue. Everything was blocked off because, of course, the water had washed out the approaches to the bridge. The bridge still stood, across the river at Lawrence Avenue, but the approaches were badly damaged and the water was flowing through at a great rate.
My name is Donald McGregor. My age is 80, and I was involved in Hurricane Hazel at the time. I lived in Weston, and the morning after the storm had subsided, I got out the camera that a friend of mine had left at the house and went and got some film and went and took pictures of the aftermath, and I just missed taking pictures of them taking Joe Ward and his wife off the roof of their house on what used to be Raymar Drive. And I used to work with Joe Ward, and he gave me the story on how he survived the flood. And his wife went to bed upstairs, and he was downstairs sitting in an easy chair and watching television, but dozed off, and he had his feet up on the hassock. And when he put his feet down, everything was in darkness, and he put his feet down into water. And he couldn't believe what had happened, and he so happened to get a flashlight, which was handy to him, and made his way round and got up into the upstairs, and his wife, and broke through into the attic through an opening, and then got up into the attic, and the water was, at that time, was really coming up, and he broke through. He got a hold of something up in the attic and broke through the sheeting and the shingles and got out under the roof of the building and waited to be rescued. And that was the helicopter that you saw in the tape that rescued him off the building. And everything was, other buildings and other people were swept away downriver. This over is the Lawrence Avenue Bridge here. Westmount, and this is where Raymar Drive was. You can see it's all been wiped out. And this is the flats on Weston there in the fairgrounds. The water's receded a bit, and you see all the mud and the cars all flooded in. That is Westmount on the far side there. There's the helicopter that took the people off from Raymar Drive, rescued them on the roof of their house. This is putting the rope across for to connect up communications with the west side of in Etobicoke, Western. These are people rubbernecking.
My name is Felicia McKechnie, and I was 42 years old when Hurricane happened in 1954. And friends of ours lived off Scarlett Road, right near Raymore Drive. They backed onto the Humber. I think it was a helicopter going over the Humber with a body. The body was dangling down. And also all of the furniture, the fridges and the stoves and things that were floating down the Humber.
This is by Christina Mitchell Pasolak. As I write this, I am saddened by events even today, October 15th, 2000. Floods and disasters are occurring all over the world. Friday, October the 15th, 1954. This will always be a never forgotten day in my life. As I write this, I am thinking of a dear co-worker. I was still working at Sunbeam Corporation on Weston Road at that time. It had rained quite heavily during the day, and as the last hour came to go home, I had mentioned to Mary, teasing of course, "Can you swim?" She said no. There was laughter amongst us as we were young and full of devilment. We were used to teasing one another as we all worked together on an assembly line. Mary had not been married very long, and her husband had bought a little house on Raymore Drive in Weston, and as you all know, that whole street was wiped out. And of course, when we arrived back at work on Monday morning, October 18th, 1954, and heard about the street being wiped out, we realized that we had lost Mary along with her husband. It was weeks before the bodies were recovered. First her husband, and then Mary. I went to the funeral with Supervisor Les Hillcock to say our last goodbyes.
I know that I was given a sticker. I didn't have a car, but I was given a sticker for a car. And after we were finished, so 3 or 4 days after, I took a drive up to Raymore Drive, because I would say half of the losses that we saw were from Raymore Drive. And I went up and drove down Raymore Drive, which was then drivable. And that was really upsetting to see those little frame houses all tipped over and so on up there.
As far as vehicles going across the river, they'd have to go down, I think they went down to Dundas. I don't know what the bridge was like on Eglinton, I can't remember. But I know the St. Philip's Road Bridge was open. But after they were checked, they'd let them go across, then they had to bring in fill and everything to fill in the approaches again and make sure they were secure before the people went over.
One of the Alliance was a gentleman by the name of Harold Stonehouse, whose farm was over on Martin Grove, had brought his tractor over just shortly before the hurricane because they were doing some landscaping at the arena. And as luck would have it, the tractor was there when Hurricane Hazel struck. The water rose, and all of his tractor was covered by water except for the exhaust pipe, which extended above the level of the water. And after the water went down and he looked at his tractor and it was covered with mud and didn't look so good, he thought he'd give it a try. He turned the key and his tractor started. And he felt that that was an accolade for Massey Harris, that what they constructed in the way of tractors was very good if they could withstand Hurricane Hazel. That was a real feather in Massey.
This here is the Pine Point golf course, and this is the flats, and the C&R Bridge there in northern Etobicoke. These houses there were flooded and been since disposed of. This is still on the flats. This here is over on the Humber River at the old Albion Road, going to Thistletown.
My name is Leslie Phillips. We lived in the what was known as the Woodbridge Trailer Park on the 14th of October 1954, and as I remember the day, it had rained quite a bit, and I came home from work around 5 o'clock, and I remember digging a bit of a trench to drain some of the water away from the door as we were as Dorothy was making supper, and my brother-in-law was visiting from out of town, and we had supper and sat around after supper, and I think about 9 o'clock I decided to go to the bathroom. I had to go outside for over to the outside facilities. The trailers in those days don't have inside plumbing, and I remember stepping out the door and I saw there was about 2 inches of water on the ground, so I decided to go back and put on my long rubber boots. So I went inside and pulled them on and came out. By that time the water was up to the top of the boots. So then I decided I went back in then and told my brother-in-law, it looks like we're going to have a bit of a flood, I better get his car up to higher ground. So by the time he got his coat and boots on, water was up past our knees. So decided then we better get Dorothy out too, so I went back and told her to come, and she pulled her coat on and we carried her out to the car and set her in the back seat, and her ankles, water was up past her ankles whenever she put her feet on the floor in the car. Drove out the driveway and there was a car stalled in front of us with, got water in the engine I guess, and somebody come to the side and asked if we could take the children. So I told them to just shove them in the window, and by that time the clutch was slipping so bad that the motor wasn't pulling much, and we got up to higher ground and those people got out of the car and took the children.
This is at Woodbridge on number 7 highway. When they closed it off, you'll see them where the river is broken through on the highway and taking it out, and the provincial police
Well, my name is Fred Bull. At that time I would be 25 years old, and I was living at the time in Caledon on my parents' farm at what is now 19085, I think it is, Heart Lake Road, or at that time was known as the Second Line East, and I was working at Avro. And what my memories of it at that week is when my job at Avro at that time, I was looking for drawings, tooling, and chasing down repair orders and such like on planes. I was actually working in the sheet metal shop. And I can remember being outside several times, and it was raining, as they say, like it was going out of style. Everything was wet around it, And the Friday, I remember going over to flight test, and it was like walking across a lake. There was about 2 inches of water on the apron between flight test and the main plant. And I came in soaking wet and said, I'm not going back out there again until it stops raining, which it didn't. And my recollections of coming out that night and catching my ride back home to Caledon was of everywhere there was water. It was just like a lake. And I recall one man, whether it was that night or the night before, running down the driveway sort of towards Airport Road to catch his ride. And he gradually got deeper and deeper and finally ended up in the ditch right up to his knees. Now, it was raining all the way home. I remember that. And when I got home, well, we had to go out to the barn and help with the milking. And we were leaning into the storm as we walked out to the barn. There was a man named, my father was Ben Bull, mother was Violet Bull, and there was a boy that was making his home there by the name of Ken Wilcox. Well, Ken and I struggled out to the barn, and when we opened the barn door, you could hear a sort of a moaning. I don't know, pigs, nobody would believe me that they could whine, but that's the only way I could describe it. They weren't really squealing, they were just standing in the pen in about an inch of water, and the water was coming through the wall. Their pen was on the east side of the barn, and it was actually raining sideways. There was a pen of calves in the same predicament, and they were the same way, squishing around in the water. So we had to dig little ditches and put up little dikes of manure. That was all we had. And we got the water running out the doors, and we had no problem getting the pigs to come out of the pen and move to a drier area. We got straw, of course, dry straw, and bedded them down. We got the milking finished. And when we came back in from the barn, it was the same thing, the wind and the rain. It was just lashing. We didn't really hear too much about it because no television in those days. We just heard on the radio that there had been storms and there was flooding. And then the next morning, of course, it came out what a flood there had been. And the pictures that were taken, my mother walked down the road to have a look, and everything was full of water. All the ditches, any little puddle that there was. As you could say, if you had spit at that time, it would have run straight to Lake Ontario. The pasture field that those pictures show that was flooded I never saw anything close to that, even in the spring floods. And the ditches south of there were the same way. The whole fields, there's low fields all around there, and everything.
You've been looking at photographic records of an event made by ordinary people, which they have preserved themselves for half a century amongst their family records. They thought that it was an important piece of history, and now they are sharing it with a new generation. You've been hearing and sharing the recollections of people who, a half century ago, were young adults at the beginning of their professional lives, some just beginning their families. One, a university student, one a fireman, another a police officer, still another an aircraft worker, and a farmer, all taking responsibilities for others at the time of the disaster. You have seen nature raging, homes devastated, the poignancy of a lawn chair or a bookcase standing among the debris, reminding us of a very personal, the people affected, their loss. One of Hazel's greatest legacies to the Toronto area is the extensive network of linked greenbelts throughout its watersheds. A carryover, they help define the quality of life we have 50 years later, as does the compassion.
Well, they did all kinds of things. There were the people that were out looking for bodies. There were the people that were on cleanup crews for what could be. People took clothing and food to people that had lost their home. People took people in to their homes until they were able to find places. And these are people who would not normally take anybody into their home, you know, but when it was a crisis, they did it.
Well, what impact did it have I was very young at the time, very adventurous. I'd been a volunteer firefighter prior to going on the permanent fire department, and it was a very romantic job, and riding a red fire truck and with the bell going and the sirens going and the whole bit. But it had an effect on me that I realized that life could be gone very, very quickly, and that you must live every day on its own. And I still do it to this day. I'm thankful that I woke up this morning breathing at 75 years of age.